Cheltenham, Adelaide, South Australia, 1977. Mrs. Amelia Rosa Simper lives by herself within her local community. Well known and well liked, she says goodnight to her neighbour and daughter Christina Sperling on the night of the 2nd of December. The following morning, emergency services are called after Christina and her husband, Don, find Mrs. Simper murdered in her bed. Detective Sergeant Barry Frank Cox, the head of the Technical Services Division of the South Australian Police Force, took lead of the investigation. What is it that Sergeant Cox collected at the scene?
He collected almost all the trace evidence. He collected paint and metal particles observed throughout the scene and in Mrs. Simper's bed sheets. He also found wood shavings and seeds on the windowsill, as well as fibres and multiple hairs near the bed.
And who conducted the initial analysis on the evidence?
Sergeant Cox did. However, he also involved the work of various specialists to undertake an extensive analysis.
And by specialists, you mean the ones that were forensically trained?
No, actually, only one of the 7 people he hired had some form of forensic background.
Do you think Sergeant Cox personally being involved in the collection, analysis and referral of secondary analysis may have caused some issues?
Oh, definitely. Sergeant Cox himself had no forensic qualification. He should never have collected the evidence, as he doesn't understand the proper proceedings of evidence collection or evidence analysis for that matter. Many individuals became involved and they were there under his recommendation. If this didn't cause any bias, then it definitely caused some inconsistencies. The constant ratio of paint and metal led Sergeant Cox to a local factory, Wilson's Engineering, and to Mr. Edward Splatt himself, the head spray painter there.
Cox concluded that Edward Splatt must have been involved, as there were many connections made between the particles and his environment. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Mrs. Amelia Rosa Simper on March 3, 1978. And what happened during Edward Splatt's trial?
The prosecution, which consisted of Head Prosecutor Bishop and Sergeant Cox, convinced the jury that Mr. Splatt murdered Mrs. Simper. Cox was allowed to present his theories and his interpretation of the evidence. He essentially acted as a qualified forensic expert when he wasn't.
What was it that convinced the jury that Mr. Splatt was the killer?
That would be the linkage evidence. There were items missing from the scene that were found at Mr. Splatt's home and found hair samples which were said to match Splatt by one of the specialists. But most of all, it was the paint, metal, fibres and seeds that ultimately convinced the court that no one else but Splatt could have been there when Mrs. Simper was murdered.
Did he have any defence?
The defence was pretty weak. However, they didn't have any access to the trace evidence. The prosecution team had a very detailed viewpoint of the scene and access to all of the evidence, whereas the defence had to go in blind.
After his appeal was dismissed, Mr. Splatt felt if he didn't do something to prove his innocence, he would spend his life wrongly convicted in prison. He wrote a detailed account of what he felt were errors present in the police and forensic proceedings and sent them to the investigative journalist Stuart Cockburn. After reading the trial transcripts, Splatt's account and the analysis of the scientific analysis, Mr. Cockburn was convinced Splatt was innocent. By May 2nd, 1981, he had wrote a series of articles in the Adelaide Advertisement to demonstrate why Splatt's conviction was a great miscarriage of justice.
Splatt knew how influential Mr. Cockburn was in the legal avenue. He knew he could create a medial outrage, and that's exactly what happened.
The constant publication of Cockburn's articles caught the attention of the Legal Services of South Australia, who employed Mr. Frank Moran QC to re-evaluate the case.
Mr. Moran concluded that the police investigation was indeed unscientific and slipshod, and they're his words, not mine.
There was a great debate whether the evidence should have been collected by the police authorities, and whether the analysis of this evidence should have been undertaken outside the advice of forensic experts. It was also questioned whether someone other than a forensic witness should have given their professional opinion in relation to the connection of evidence to a certain person or event.
Eventually, the Liberal and Labour parties became involved in the debate. In the upcoming election, Splatt knew that if Labour was granted into power of Parliament, he might have a chance of being released. He convinced everyone he knew to vote for Labour in the hopes that it would have some influence on the results.
On November 6, 1982, Labour was placed into Parliament after winning that year's election, and Splatt was finally granted a royal commission by the new General Attorney.
Without reaching out to the media and to Stuart Cockburn, Splatt would still be in Adelaide jail. He would never have been released.
The Splatt case became partly responsible for the formation of the National Institute of Forensic Science. It was established to improve the standards in the procedures of forensic and police laboratories due to the mishandling and inappropriate collection of trace evidence.
The Royal Commission understood that the evidence was definitely mishandled by Sergeant Cox. The trace evidence became available to both parties of the retrial, and Cox's statement became discredited due to his improper proceedings. It was this that ultimately led to Splatt's release from prison.
No one, except for Mr. Edward Splatt and Mrs. Simper, knows what occurred on the night of December 2nd, 1977. Whether Splatt did it or not, an elderly woman was brutally assaulted and killed, and that was the real tragedy here.